Hey everyone, Simon here. I hope you're all well. Cheers, it's non-alcoholic, don't worry. I hope summer is starting off nice and well for you. Because I know it's been a crap couple of years. I wanted to do a bit of a life update video around what's going on. As you've just seen by the title, it's probably titled something quite depressing and morbid, so heads up. Although in this specific situation, no one has actually died. So I just want to make that clear out front. But what it has done over the last 8 or 9 months is my life has been really focused around death, dying, dignity, quality of life, all of those kind of conversations. And it's been really clear to me that I was just totally unprepared for the whole situation. So this is a rambly video around what's been going on. And maybe some tips or advice, or if I'd had my time again type of conversation. I do these videos every once in a while around big topics that either have happened in my life or people have contacted me via various DMs on different social media platforms. I always feel quite privileged that people feel that they can reach out to me, although please do take whatever I say with a massive pinch of salt, because I'd have no better opinion than anyone else. So I'm going to kind of chunk this up into what's kind of gone on, like part 1, what's kind of gone on part 2, and kind of drop in thoughts and just ideas and things to consider as we go through it. So, towards the back end of last year, my dad was diagnosed with colon cancer. It was some of the earlier stages of cancer, which is very helpful because as you go through the stages 1 to 4, the higher the number, the more advanced the cancer is, the less likelihood that you'll still be with us in X amount of years' time. So we were given like the news awkwardly because it was during a pandemic at the time, and that meant that there was a lot of conflicting information as to whether or not someone could go with Dad to make sure that he got support during that diagnosis. We were told not to go. And then when he got there, he was told that someone could have been there. So just an advance warning, you can have someone with you. And I wish we'd have known that so that he didn't have to go through that particular meeting alone. The diagnosis was that the cancer was inside his colon and hadn't breached a colon wall, which is a good thing because then it means it's not spreading anywhere. But because it was done during the lockdown periods in the UK, we had cancelled every other type of surgery that was going on, whether it was life-threatening or not, because it was so focused on the COVID-19 response, rightly or wrongly. That's just how it was. So we were kind of left dangling with a carrot. The other kind of awkwardness around all of this is that whilst the prognosis from a cancer, like it's curable, was great and actually kind of made you go, whew, a little bit. It sounds awful to say, but there's like, it's one of the better cancers to have if you're going to pick one. Not that I'd wish that on anyone, but you know what I mean. The complications with my dad is that he's got lots of other health conditions that's accumulated over time and worsened by being categorised as vulnerable during the pandemic and basically having his life shrink right down. And so that meant that we were kind of warned that he could go ahead with the operation to have the cancer removed and a colonoscopy and get a colostomy bag and all of that kind of stuff. But it meant that he was running against a really, really high risk. So there was more chance of him not coming out of the operation either alive at all, or if he did, he would have some serious complications. And there's more chance of that happening than everything to actually run smoothly. And then because we didn't kind of know when it would happen, it left us dangling, like, how long's a piece of string? What do I feel about all of this? And this opened up a massive kind of Pandora's box that I hadn't really had to deal with massively in a family dynamic, at least anyway, before, around what do you do to take charge of your own destiny, I guess. So my dad's initial response was fear, I guess, and being scared. He's 71-year-old Scotsman, Scottish through and through. I can't do the accent. I won't even try. I sound Indian when I do. Just offend everyone all at once. But what that means is that he doesn't do emotions well. He's part of like old school where it's like emotions bad, push away, and he's got like proper ostrich syndrome where he's like, oh my god, there's some sand, oh my head's in it, and he reverted to that, but it was under the guise of I don't want to have the operation. I would rather just like, I've had my life and I've had my time. And there's nothing left for me to live for, so let me die type thing. And he'd kind of given up, which I found personally really difficult to deal with. And hence the opening up of conversations around death, dying, quality of life, dignity, respect, and all of these different things start to fall out. And it just became really clear that we'd never really had any of these types of discussions before, either as a family unit. Very rarely had them with other people as well. And we just don't seem to talk about this at all, specifically in Western society. It's a bit more open in other cultures. But we kind of just bury our heads in the sands and just don't think about it. We might have a will set up somewhere to deal with some of like the immediate logistics, but it's all the hearts and minds part of this that we kind of sweep under the rug and hope that we don't have to deal with it. Or when we do come to deal with it, it's already too late. And that was what we kind of found out with all of our discussions. So the main kind of takeaway point from this ramble, however long it goes on for, is have these conversations earlier. And before you hit like a critical mass point where someone's been diagnosed with something and you think, oh fuck, what do I do now? Because I wish we'd have had a lot of this conversation beforehand, because it's so emotionally charged when you get into these situations that you can't think with clarity or from an objective point of view. What I mean by an objective point of view is that my dad, in his 70s, feels like he's done what he wanted with his life. He got married, he had kids. Hello. Oh dear, disappointment incoming. Wah, wah. He's got my brother and sister from my mum's first marriage, so he's kind of got an extended family. They've grown up and married, and they've now got kids, and then there's great grandkids that have recently popped in as well. And it's like he's ticked off all of his list, and he's like, cool, I'm done now. Anything else? Like the run was good whilst it lasted. And I find that such an alien perspective to deal with, because I've not lived his life. I'm late 30s, I am naturally curious and want to stick my snout in all of the different things that are out there in the world, experience different cultures, different ideas, events, foods, whatever it is. I get my dirty little trotters in and have a good rummage around, because that's just, I like to be curious and interested in life. And so having someone say that they're disinterested in life and that they don't feel like there's anything worth fighting for, when you've already got that emotionally charged situation, it's like building up layers of like a rainbow cake, because you've got, oh, we've got cancer, oh, there's complications, oh, actually you're going to have to face the facts that there could be end of life issues here, even if you take the good route for the operation, but you're already committing yourself to a certain death at some point. Now, admittedly, we're not all going to last forever, but it's like willingly shorting your life out for all of this kind of stuff. Oh, you've said that nothing is worth staying around for. Aren't I worth staying around for? Isn't your wife worth staying around for? What else is there out in the world that would convince you to stay? And so it became very difficult to be objective and to see people from different points of view. And I started to go on a bit of a personal crusade to like dangle carrots in front of him, basically, to be like, wouldn't that make you want to stay in this world a little bit longer? And oh, what happens if, I don't know, me and my other half go and get a place together? Oh, wouldn't that be good? You can come around and visit. That'll be worth hanging on for. You've not seen me get married yet. I might get married at some point in the future. Fuck knows how that would happen, but don't you want to hang around for that? No. Essentially, because when you get to that point of life where you feel so disinterested and shut in, and especially when it's come off the back of what would have been just over 18 months of a seemingly endless lockdown for being category 1 vulnerable of a person, where like they already had quite small, tiny lives, and I mean that with love and without like being disrespectful. My parents are quite happy with a small, tiny life, and that's what they like and it's what they enjoy. But that became so shrunk down that you kind of go, well, what am I hanging on in for? It's like waiting for God in a way, that you just kind of go, oh, well, when's he coming? And it felt a bit like that for my dad, is how I was kind of being led around. But it also started to force other conversations around when is enough enough? And so he started going into conversations about, well, what happens if I don't have the operation and I start to get very unwell? At what point would I want you to do me in, type things? Or when I could go to like Switzerland and get some euthanasia done. Oh, jolly, that would be great. Not been abroad for ages. And it would be such weird and odd conversations, but they were important ones to have, because it starts to help you kind of work out, actually, at what point does dignity become such a factor that actually you don't want your family members doing personal care, for example? At what point, so like we had like a colostomy bag, and dealing with all of that going on was kind of a big fear for my dad. I think from my own point of view and my mum's point of view, I think we're a bit more practical. And so we was like, cool, we'll watch some YouTube videos, work out how to do it with a panache. And you just kind of, you get on with it. Whereas he'd hit that kind of overload of information, that it just made it very difficult for him to be able to process stuff. So for him, it was just like, I will switch off and not deal with anything. And in a way, actually, the delay of several months of not knowing let him pendulum back and forth between, I don't want the operation, oh, go on then, fuck it, let's have a go, oh, no, I'm back to scared, oh, da, 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 da. And it just so happened he was back in the I'll give it a go after Christmas, and we kind of was able to not forcefully keep him in that state, but kind of keep the good vibes going as best as possible, so that we could try and keep him in a positive attitude, that actually, if you don't go ahead for something, you've committed yourself to a death sentence that actually could get very messy and very tricky to deal with, because dignity and respect start to erode away. And it's not just with cancer, you get that with dementia, for example, or any other kind of long-term degenerative disease. You need to have those conversations around, what does dignity and respect mean to you? Are you happy with family members chipping in? Do you want personal carers coming in? At what point would you consider going to a hospice, for example? And then we started to have conversations as a family, the three of us. Obviously there's wider people, but they've got their own families and stuff to deal with, so it's very difficult to kind of get everyone to chip in. But we were starting to talk much more about, like, well, at what point does caring from our point of view become too much to cope with as the carer? Because you almost all need to have some kind of agreement before heading in as to, like, what's the point where you tap out? And that was some very difficult conversations, because my mum is extremely practical, not emotional, whereas my dad is emotional, not practical. So it works quite well as a couple, actually. But individually, never the twain shall meet. However, if you need to know where our nearest toilet is within any kind of public environment, my mum will know. So there's a skill for everything. So yeah, it just made it very, very tricky to have some of those conversations, because my mum was coming at it purely from a practical perspective and not thinking about emotion. So to get her to admit, actually, at what point does it become unpractical, almost like starting to translate to, that's where my emotional turmoil will boil over. At the same time as all of this was going on, my mum was actually diagnosed with some illness as well, which we're still kind of working through at the moment. Not nearly as life-changing, I would say, but just kind of bubbling away at the background. So obviously she's got an awful lot going on with all of this as well. And I was trying to maintain a full-time job at the same time as dealing with all of this type of stuff. So yeah, my big kind of takeaways from this kind of era of stuff is A, you can go to the hospital and all of the appointments and be there as the care provider or support person, and that is okay even during COVID restrictions. Secondly, make sure that you get in contact with people who can help you navigate through some of the paperwork side of stuff. Macmillan were fantastic from a cancer perspective, but there are definitely different organisations that help you throughout different types of degenerative illnesses. As part of one of my old jobs that I had, because I worked for the civil service in the UK, I used to work with an awful lot of health organisations around specifically communications. It was to try and help different organisations navigate around the benefit system so that they could help people in need when they needed it to. But there's so many different services that will help out specific illnesses. You just need to know that they're out there so that you can then get in touch, and they really do help you navigate around stuff, because we had issues that our local hospitals weren't able to deal with stuff because my dad was going to need to be in a high dependency unit. So then he started to fall outside of the normal parameters of how stuff gets done. And it makes it just very tricky to navigate, and they were superb at being able to help. Thirdly, don't wait until you've had these types of shocks to the system to be able to have these types of conversations. I think it's very worthwhile having them way beforehand so that people know what your wishes are. And specifically for us, so there was kind of two traits to this. One around actually what is the reality of choosing not to go around and do something, because choosing to not do something is still a huge choice to make. And it doesn't just impact the person that's around, like in front of you. It's also an impact for the people that are going to have to pick up the tab, I guess, from the caring perspective. Now, one of the things I think we did get right was always making sure that it was my dad that made the final decision. We would weigh in potentially, but only when asked, for what we think we would do if we was in that situation. But I know Mum was as well. We were always at pains to say this would be how we would tackle it, and so you could kind of see it from different perspectives. So you could weigh up different options and go, oh, maybe I've not really thought of it like that. But ultimately, the decision was always down to him, and we would, once he'd made that decision, we would support whatever decision it was that he would make, even if that fundamentally went against maybe what we would personally do, because it's his decision at the end of the day. The other thing I'd say as well is that we'd need to... There is absolutely a time and a place for positivity. And there's been a lot of studies around people being positive with cancer diagnosis. I think it was specifically the study. And actually people who go, oh my God, this is the end, horrific, 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 versus I'm going to fucking take you on and kill you, and give it like an uppercut and come out the other side ringing that bell for freedom. There's a real kind of correlation between positivity and success and survival rate, and negativity and mortality rate. But you need to let someone well in something for a little while before you can move on. And my dad didn't really have the opportunity massively to be able to dwell. A lot of this is down to personality, I think, because he's definitely I feel like he's a depressive in waiting, to be honest. But he is a dweller, and he dwells on things all the time. So he was quite conscious to kind of only let him stay in that state for a while before pushing back up again. But I remember one of my best friends from work many years ago, quite a few years ago anyway, she was told that she had stage 4 cancer whilst we was in work over the phone. Ridiculous situation to be in. And she didn't want to have that positivity there and then straight away. She was quite happy to like be like, tomorrow I'm gonna go and like get the army boots on and go out and go to war against the cancer. But during that time, I remember we went and sat in an office for the afternoon and just had meltdown because she needed to process that and get it out of her system before kind of pulling herself together and then going, do you know what, actually you can put on the brave face for other people going forward. And I think it's important to meet people where they're at so that you can get it out of the system, process the negativity and the fear and the frustration and the oh fuck, especially with that one, because it was, as soon as you hear stage 4 you just think, oh, that's a death sentence, even though there is a chance. And she put up a fantastic fight, and for something where people were saying months and she went on for well over I think she got past 2 years before it eventually came to an end. I think being there and being able to process that kind of stuff is really, really important, because then it doesn't eat you up inside, because you've been able to process it and externalize it rather than internalize it. That's very much just me, as my own personal view. Again, all of this is just personal experience. Take it with a pinch of salt. But yeah, and then getting into that positivity, being able to be positive without being namby-pamby, I think is the other thing as well. Slightly separate issue, because funny enough, whilst all of this was going on, I've also, at my current job, been doing a piece of work around the language for people who are terminally ill or nearing the end of their life. And the big switch up is basically people moving from using the phrase terminally ill to end of life, because there's a medical kind of definition term around it. But what that's led me to do is to have lots of conversations with different organisations around how professional organisations like funeral directors and things like that talk about death, dying, respect, dignity, empathy. And what was really clear throughout all of that, and it sounds really silly and like very obvious, but being compassionate without blurring the lines of clarity is the real big key for the language that you use. And I think it was Co-op Funeral Care that I was talking to. I hope they don't mind me mentioning that they came along to our department basically and gave a talk, and it was brilliant. And one of the examples that they were using was as soon as people move away from the phrases of death and dying, it starts to bring in ambiguity for people who aren't thinking about things on the same wavelength as yourself. So they were saying things like, when you say to children, oh, nanny or granddad's gone to heaven, and then they're like, cool, okay, and then they go off because they think heaven's like up the road and they'll be back for tea. And so then you have to have the same conversation again later on to almost like brutalize, formalize it, and say, oh, actually, they're not coming back. And then like they'll be like, okay, so can we go and visit them in heaven then? So that it then starts to kind of like break it down and process it. And actually, if you remove the fluffiness, and like children can understand and grasp these kind of concepts, but we try to like over infantilize it, I guess. And so it causes much more pain and confusion. And the woman who was doing the talk, I think she was also a funeral director before she went and done the comm stuff. And she was saying that actually you could see it in funerals where children were thinking that like putting someone away in the coffin was like they were going on a plane and were coming back, and they still hadn't got it. So things like passing away and all of that kind of stuff, being able to be very direct with that compassion still built in, I think is the real takeaway from the language point of view. So, apologies, I know this is 25 minutes in and we've not even got to the op yet. Let me have a sip. I knew this would be rambly, and I hope it's helpful to someone. I don't know. Outpour. Yeah, anyway, so along came the phone call for the op. Yes, Dad was going to go forward with it. Hurrah, 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 hurrah. Now, the operation has been the least of our concerns with all of this. It went well. The cancer was removed in full. It hadn't broke the colon wall by that point. It started to spread anywhere else, so it was contained, and that was great. The colostomy bag went on. Dad started to learn how to use the colostomy bag. We've always been very careful that he kind of controls all of that. And I'll circle back to why in a bit. But we've been kind of, although we know how to do it and we've had to get involved, it's always like one of the first things that we kind of do, hands off and back to you again so that you can do the pooper scooper. Because it then means that he doesn't disassociate like the colostomy bag from himself, and that he doesn't feel ashamed or afraid of it, because he definitely had a fear of being perceived as dirty or less than for having it. It was a really odd way of thinking of it. But yeah, that was kind of how he felt, I think. So yeah, he went through all of that. But going back to what we were saying beforehand about him having potential complications from the operation going forward, that started to take place, but it started to take place just as he was being discharged. And so when he came home at the end of February, he came home like, I'm going to say like vacant in the eyes, I guess is probably the best way to describe it. He looked like a bloodhound. Like, I remember when I was shaving him and he was like looking at me, but like looking through me at the same time. It was really weird. And he wasn't quite like coherent. And then he started to become very incontinent very quickly. Then he was feeling quite ill, and then he was starting to lose like composure of his mind and going, because I initially was like, Mum, is he having a stroke? But like a really elongated one, because it was slow it was fast debilitation over like a period of 4 or 5 days, but so not like immediate stroke like, but it was all the symptoms of a stroke, but just over a 5-day period. It was really strange. But yeah, it was a water infection. It was pneumonia, was the other biggie. He'd had a drop in sodium levels, which sends you delirious, apparently. Who knew? And a work colleague's husband has exactly the same thing, and he goes nuts every once in a while as well. So if you think an elderly person has gone senile and you're thinking dementia, check their sodium levels, because that was at the root of our problem. But all of this kind of combined to send my dad into like a weird, bizarre phase where it was like it's not that he was fitting, but it was like he was fighting himself, but getting very confused and delirious. And then he tried to get out of the chair to do something or argue something. I'm not really quite sure what was going on. But he lost his balance during the night, fell over, smacked his head on the wall, done a massive crack down the back there. And we had to wait about 5 hours for an ambulance. Yay! Because, COVID backlog. So into hospital he went. And then this is where we've been really ever since, up until like really, really, really recently. So my dad has been battling pneumonia, water infection after water infection, sodium levels, which has then made his brain very foggy. But because we were thinking about very short term, like, well, he'll be home and we'll look after him and we'll build him up for strength, we started to find out that actually it's very difficult. Like, you can get away with not like mucking around with finances and diving into like bank accounts and things like that. For a short term, you can get away with it. When it starts to go over the period of month after month after month, and that person is now totally nuts that they can't remember anything. My dad don't remember anything from 2022. Like January through to about April. Nuts. And he still doesn't now. And so during all of that, it's as if, to try and coin a phrase from dementia, it's like someone has shuffled and nicked bits of like the bookcase of his memories all out and about, so that he's got like giant gaps everywhere, and like, but the emotions are still there. It's really strange. And so he doesn't remember like any of his passwords, so he didn't know how to get into his phone. But then he didn't know any of his passwords for his online banking or his email addresses. And what are we now? We're all online. And when you've got parents who weren't brought up in that kind of environment anyway, who struggle with technology at the best of time, it really puts up a barrier to society when you've got someone who has now become, I say mentally challenged. It's not really what I mean, but he's so vacant that he can't keep something in his short-term memory for very long. So he would manage to get into his phone and then like change the password on something, but he'd already forgotten it before it was written down. So then he wouldn't know like what it was. Then he would get locked out. Two-factor authentication comes on. Oh, we think there's weird activity, probably because he's sitting there going, I don't know what to do, blah, 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 blah. Locked out of everything. Then that's locked out some of your payments for stuff. And so it just has this knock-on ripple effect that it's going to be something that I want to kind of have a little mini crusade on at some point later on, because I get why things like two-factor authentication and all of this kind of stuff exists. But for the love of God, it's just such a barrier to people when you're in that time of need that it forces you outside the system. We ended up in a weird position as well, and maybe this is very specific to post-COVID in the UK, but we started to fall in between systems. So what was happening was they were starting to see some progress on my dad, which is great. So he would start to be a little bit more coherent. His infections and pneumonia would start to clear up a little bit, and he would be a little bit more cognizant. But still say things like, when are we coming back from France? Don't know, mate, you're in Essex. Sadly for you. Wah, wah. So all of this would be going on, blah, 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 blah. And then at the first point of like sign of vaguely getting better, out the hospital, back to you. And then what would happen is that you're supposed to then get outpatient care, and you'd have carers in the morning and the evening. And because he would get pushed out, and within 24 to 48 hours, he would regress back to such a poor state again that we couldn't cope. So it would be things like changing adult incontinence pads like every 15-20 minutes. He would be shouting and screaming because he would forget like where he was, not necessarily who we were, but he would like feel like we were coming into his space. Because of the rate of personal care issues that we had, he would then feel like it was undignified and then get very upset and distraught over the fact that his son was changing his incontinent pad, for example, and he didn't really want to be in that situation, which we had kind of half discussed earlier on, but now we were put into this situation where we was actively having to go against his wishes, and the emotion of it was there, but he had no recollection of any of these discussions. So for him, it was almost like we were violating things twice over. And so it was causing lots of visceral emotional reactions, which I totally get and understand. But it's very difficult when you're thinking, I've had this conversation and we've had it multi times. And this is now you feeling like we're having this conversation and we're coming across this thing for the first time again. Because it feels like it is to them, but they've still got that residual like emotion kind of flying around in the background. It was really a difficult and knackering time for us all. So having the carers come in was really, really great. Do recommend it. You get like 4 weeks for free before you then have to get like means assessed as to whether or not you're going to get it from the council continuously for free for a little bit longer, or the government, I should say. Or if you've got a certain amount of savings or capital, then you'd have to pay for some of that as well. Now, the carers don't necessarily, I should choose my words as best as possible. The carers themselves, absolutely lovely people. The actual service they provide, we could do ourselves because it was like flannel washes and things like that. But their value is not necessarily in the practicalities of what it brought, or at least not for us anyway, because between my mum and me, we could like balance a leg up and do like a flannel underneath, or we'd got a dab hand of like a four-handed colostomy bag change and all of that kind of stuff. We'd managed to get it all done. But what was really tricky, what the value was from the carers being in, was that it was a fresh, stranger pair of eyes and hands in, so that it changed up the same old faces, saying the same old things, going through the same old routine for my dad, who was sedentary in a chair for about 10 weeks in between hospital in and out throughout all of that. And he's still pretty sedentary at the moment. He's just started kind of getting some mobility back within the last week and a half, which has been lovely. But because we was like, do we really need the carers? Because you have to they give you like time periods. And then my mum's like a clean freak, so she's like, right, we'll get up early and we'll clean you before the carers get here, so that they don't have to do all of the cleaning for you. And I'm like, isn't this what the carers are here for? We aren't like trussing up a chicken. They can come and see the chicken in its full glory, because otherwise, like, why are we wasting their time? Because they've got other people to see and deal with. So like, chop, make those decisions. But speaking with the carers, what they were saying was that actually they see that as the same value as well, in that sometimes when you've got lots of loved ones around you, the people that need the care take the easier route and don't help themselves nearly as much. And it's either because they become lazy, and I don't mean that in like a lazy way, but you try less for them, because you know that the people who love you will go further than what someone who's just paid to do the job will. And so they'll bend over backwards to try and support you, which means that you actually start to not hinder their progress. I guess, do you know what, actually, yeah, you do. So we found the value from the carers coming in from that perspective, because it forced, like my dad to try and attempt to stand up for like 5 to 10 seconds so that you could do a quick swipe and wipe of the bum whilst doing a nappy change at the same time, before he'd kind of wobble so bad that you'd kind of need to get him back down again because he didn't have the muscle energy to kind of keep going. So yeah, we found that really helpful. The problem though, and it's a word of warning going back to this whole COVID thing, is that as we was going in and out of hospital, because my personal opinion, they've got COVID backlogs and they're trying to chuck people out as quickly as possible, not thinking about the long-term issue that if you chuck someone out too soon, they're going to regress and they're going to be back in for longer, which is what happened with my dad. In and out several times, poor care, very difficult to understand what was going on whilst he was in the hospitals as well, because our local hospital that he was put into then had a COVID spike, so then no one was allowed to go and visit. So then you get garbled phone calls where he was like getting other people, because he couldn't work his own phone because he'd forgotten it all. And every time we gave it to him, even if we'd like written down like the code to get in and all of that stuff, it caused issues. And he's got a Hawaii phone. I don't know how you say that, but like, if you forget all of your stuff to log in, it wipes the phone. You can't like get in and hack it, get all of your own stuff back again. So he'd lost all of his numbers, and he didn't know who to call. So then he was all confused. He didn't know numbers because his brain was scrambled. So he was like, ah! So yeah, again, digital world fucks you over. But so did the whole in and out of the hospital thing. And so what I recommend you doing is getting like a little planner matrix of name, organisation, who they do, like what is their remit, what do they do or not do, and what's like the last status of something. Because what was happening was, where he was going in and out of hospital, the caring paperwork of where the organisations talk to each other weren't catching up. So they would not get a cancellation through by the time he'd like be chucked back out of hospital again. And so we would be phoning up and counselling something. Then they would come through and say, oh, he's an outpatient and it's come back through again. And then the cancellation from the first time around would come through afterwards. And then we'd be like, where's the carer? And they'd be like, well, it's been cancelled. And we're like, no, he's been in and out of hospital since then. The Macmillan person tried their very best to try and sort some of this out. But of course, then they get embroiled into everything as you go along. One of the few things that did go very well in all of that kind of paperwork shuffle, though, was getting support for your property. And so getting like banister rails installed, handrails for outside. So my parents have got to their house was like 2 steps down. So the idea was that at some point, assuming that my dad would get well enough to ever get back outside again, he would at least have something to cling on to get up and down those steps. There was a special offer on special offer around stair lifts at the time. Now, we chose to not go down that route personally, but the fact that that was offered to us is fantastic. We didn't go for the stair lift because what we wanted to do, it sounds cruel, but we wanted to try and put back control back to my dad as best as possible, because during all of this, he became controlless and out of control of his destiny. And that was a root of a lot of his frustration. And I think this is probably one of my final points, because I realise this has gone on for absolutely ages and I'm sorry. I hope it's been informative or interesting or helpful to someone. But in all of this kind of shuffle of paperwork and appointments and looking after stuff and logistics, my dad is sat there. He started to get some of his marbles back, not fully, but slowly, drip, 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 feed. He then is sedentary, can't do anything, has no control over anything, and has no like mobility. It's like his brain, as it starts to come back online again, admittedly still missing months, still very foggy, but like able to hold cognizant conversations. It's like he's stuck in a prison of his body, and he's frustrated, and then that frustration starts to boil out onto the people that do the caring for it. So what we wanted to do was to start giving him back bits of control. So one of the first things back was you can start to own your colostomy bag changes. Whoop, back it goes. So that he could then start to get into the finesse of doing that for himself again. Because then that gives him the autonomy to be like, right, okay, bag's full, need a change. I can do that. The kit is next to me. I'm an autonomous colostomy bag changer. And that sounds like such a small little tiny thing, but it gave him control. It was making sure that something would... sorry, it just put me off because it just said it's reached a 4 gig limit on the phone. Where was I? Yes. So that kind of little bit of control would continue to like grow and grow and grow over time. So then we would start to give him some telephone numbers so that he could then start to phone some of those organisations and start to try and organise some of the stuff himself, so that he could then start to be a bit more in control of that stuff. Because my mum was having to deal with her own medical stuff now coming up, because we're now hitting into April, mid-April into May. So she needs to kind of think about, how's this all going? But also, I'm still doing a full-time job. And so if I'm on hold for something for a few hours trying to sort out something or get some information, I'm doing work calls at the same time, because you can't, like, it domino effects into all of the caring responsibilities and the people that have to pick up the care as well. So I've been very fortunate that my job has enabled me to work from home most of the time, and then my home becomes where I need to be. So if I'm working... like when you're going in for operations or checkups and stuff, and he's got to do the self-isolation a few days beforehand, my mum will do the isolation with him, because they don't want to bring anything in to jeopardise the next thing that happens. That kind of fear and worry then starts to spiral into, say, prescriptions, for example. So if he was running low on something, Our prescription services are woeful around where we are in Essex. So you'd need to be on the phone for like several hours to get through to see whether or not a prescription is ready, so that you could then organise either my mum or me going to pick up the prescription in between work meetings, or sometimes I'd be on a work meeting whilst like in the middle of the pharmacy trying to collect something up, mask on, all of that kind of stuff. It's just, you do what you do to try and get by, but it's just it's a very difficult struggle to cope with. The very last thing that I want to bring up around all of this is progress and celebrating the small wins. And this is because the cancer bit went well and it went fine. And we've since had the news that he won't need any radio or chemotherapy, and that the cancer seems to have been removed totally in full, and he'll just need to go back for like checkups at certain points in time. And that is absolutely the best news that's out there. But why I wanted to bring up the whole kind of discussing dignity, quality of life, at what point is enough, was that my dad regressed quite quickly back to, I don't want to be here anymore. I feel like I'm dying. I'm wasting away. I look like death walking. I don't want people to see me like this. Could you take me away and leave me somewhere? And we had some really, really dark conversations around him wanting to be done in, basically, because he didn't want to be left in this kind of situation or state again. And that's very difficult to deal with when you feel like you've got over the worst of it. And then it's almost like you're building up to this home straight. And it circles back to meeting people where they're at, so you can kind of have that practical discussion over it all. And actually, what does that mean for everyone? And just, yeah, sitting in that space, I guess. It sounds super vague. I know it sounds super vague. I don't really want to go into like the massive details that we went into. But the fact that we discussed some of that at length, and the practicalities, and like what really that means for doing that kind of stuff, and choosing the negative path again, I think by being able to get some of that out of his system, it's taken an awful long time, because he's been in that period for over 3 months. The last couple of weeks, there's been a real noticeable change in behaviour. I don't really know what triggered it. But it's celebrating the little wins and the victories towards independence and getting some of your life back again. And I think my dad felt like the level of life that he had before all of this versus the level that he's come out with from hospital all the way down here, and then he felt like he could only ever get to maybe here, and that wasn't where his quality of life for happiness would be. But what he was missing was that actually it's going to take tiny little steps of progress. So we've got him like this little pedal bike thing. You can put on the table and you can use it for your hands, but you can also use it for your feet. It looks like a little hamster when you do it. But it's to slowly build up some of his muscle in his legs and his arms so that he could then stand. And then it wasn't standing shaky with a walker for a few seconds and then collapsing back down. And we'd go, okay, that was 3 seconds today. This afternoon, we'll give it another go and let's see if we can get to 4. And it's about like really breaking down the tiniest little breadcrumbs so that you can see that progress develop over time. And to him, it's like frustration screaming hell from the inside, internal screaming, that meme. But it's important to lay all of that out, because you very quickly forget the progress that you've made. And you need to kind of keep circling back and going, but do you remember last week you couldn't make it across the living room, and now you have with your walker. And isn't that a great thing? And yeah, you're out of breath, and yeah, your COPD's like going nuts, but you've made it, and you didn't think that you would ever get out of that chair again, and you was waiting to die in the chair. Now look at you. How does this now feel? Isn't this one step to independence? Do you know what? Maybe by this time next week, you might actually make it to the kettle so that you can make yourself a cuppa. Wouldn't that be great? And doesn't that give you back some independence again? There's a thin line, I think, between how you lay that out and over babyfying it, I think. And I think I got this wrong early on, if I'm being honest. I was treating my dad like a toddler because it was like having a toddler. Not that I've got children, but it reminded me of I did some work experience in like a care home when I was 16. We'd done a couple of weeks in there. And it was the way how, like, when you were feeding people and all of that kind of stuff, I'd like be making polite conversation. I'd be like, "Oh, here comes the train of a mashed potato." Choo, 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 choo. You could see like the old people were like, their eyes were like, "What the fuck?" But I became quite the popular person anyway. So they were like, "Oh, it's the young man! It's the young man!" Ooh. Mainly because I knew where the fucking biscuit barrel was. They knew they had a soft touch of me. Oh, I'd love a custard cream. But I applied like the same situation again to my dad, and little mini treats coming along. If you can get to the end of that, we can do a little bit of a mini roll or something like that. Bribes will work perfectly fine for me. So yeah, structuring that in a way that means that it doesn't take, it feels earnest and worthwhile and earned, even if it's tiny and small, because otherwise it just feels like you're babying people and then people tell you to fuck off, basically, which is kind of where we ended up. And then I kind of de-babied it a little bit. But funny enough, so like my dad was with the physio. He was saying on the first couple of visits, he was like, "I will never get outside this house ever again. I'm too scared. I don't think I can deal with stairs, for example, ever again." And then we've been working over the last few weeks of like a bit like really shit step aerobics. So he's at like the bottom of the stairs, and then he's like, we'll get up one, we'll do one, and then we'll try and do like the back down again, because obviously it's different muscles, and where he's not really stepped forward and he's doddery on his feet, and it's trying to get that stuff back going again. It feels like rehabilitation physio. So trying to get all of that kind of going and being like, just, he wouldn't have thought of that as a win. And I don't think he thought of it as a win when he was doing it either. But it wasn't until we kind of replayed that back to him and said, "Did you know, like, do you remember 2 weeks ago you said that that would never happen, and you've just done it? Fuck yeah." And really celebrating all of that stuff, I think, has started to help us get on a path towards wherever we're going. And I don't know where we are going. I don't know how much better he will become. I don't know what the future holds. It's a very different future to what we would have said this time last year, when everything seemed relatively normal and straightforward in the world, pandemic notwithstanding. It's also left me to evaluate some of my life choices and decisions as well, I think. I'm probably still processing an awful lot of that myself too. Some of that's more around, actually, I'm hitting my late 30s. What's the legacy I want to leave behind? What are the things that most matter and are important to me? What's cathartic and a great kind of, how do I want to spend my time? What do I want to be remembered for? What keeps me interested and engaged in life, I guess. Yeah, I'm not really sure where I'm going with all of that, but we'll see. it certainly made me appreciate people, family, things, and by things I mean like emotional type things much more than what I did before. Yeah, it's interesting. Outside of obviously I do this channel for games, and I run a website for games and all that kind of stuff. I do a sister thing for music as well, because music was my first passion before I learnt to pick up a controller at the young age of about 8 or 9, whatever it was, my ZX Spectrum. The music I found to be a really cathartic thing. I always have done. I love music to bits. Love me a miserable music. And there were 3 albums that kind of popped out around like relatively recently that were very, very helpful for me. One was by Tom Rosenthal called Denis Was a Bird, and that was about his dad passing away, or dying rather, I should be saying. Take your own advice, Simon. Because that's got a range of emotions, of just the roller coaster of how you go on like a journey of someone's like end of their life. Very, very insightful. Tori Amos, Ocean to Ocean, that's largely about the death of her mother and how that's affected her and how that's left her kind of wanting to keep memories of her mum alive, but also safe so that no one else can change them. And I thought that was really interesting. Because one of the things that I was thinking of was like, how do you remember someone when they're gone? And like, this isn't like a totally new experience. I've lost family members, I've lost friends, I've lost people in a variety of ways as well, either through like cancer, heart attacks, natural causes from being old age, but also from suicide as well. And like, how does that change how you view someone because they took their own life? And that was quite pertinent in my dad's case, because there was an awful lot of worry that if he gets some mobility back and he's still in a depressive state, that he would do something. So yeah, tricky. And then the third one, I think it's probably the oldest one. It's by a group called Tunng, Tunng, called Death Club. And it's this concept of when someone that you love and hold dear very close to you dies, you join the death club, because you know exactly how it feels. And it's almost like an unspoken language and feeling that you just belong to part of that club and you get it. And that album takes a look at how death is dealt with across different cultures. And it also has, I think it's a 6-part podcast where they interview various different people around how they've dealt with death. And I found that really, really insightful and interesting to hear it from different perspectives, particularly around there's a song on the album called Swedish Death Cleaning. And I'm assuming it's a real concept in Sweden, where you can hire a company to come in after you've died in Sweden, and they clear out all of the stuff so that you don't have anything embarrassing, weird or wonderful there for when your family come to see the place and get the memorabilia, I guess. So yeah, there's that. And if you're interested in the topic about just language, talking about death, dying, or if you're in that kind of situation yourself and you want to get different perspectives, there's also a podcast called Dying Matters. And they talk about how death, dying and everything just kind of is in society, and how we should have much more open and honest conversations about it all. I think from my perspective, I'm going to be much more honest and open and direct about some of these conversations going forward. I urge everyone to do the same, really. It doesn't have to be miserable and depressing all the way through. I appreciate that this video probably was for the vast majority of it. But I think if you tackle it head on, it gets away, it removes the awkwardness and the mystique around it all, and you can, when you hit the difficult moments where the emotions do come in when someone is diagnosed or given a diagnosis on something, you don't have that extra layer of what the fuck does this mean for us, because you already know. And I think that can only be a good thing. So yeah, thanks for watching. I hope that was helpful to, even if it's just helpful to one person out there, it was worth doing. Take care.